It happened on a hot July afternoon in the quiet town of Ridgeford, Pennsylvania, a place where people thought racism was something that lived in old history books, not in the middle of Main Street. But what went down that day proved otherwise, and before I even tell you how it all exploded, let me be clear, you need to watch until the very end because what the boss of these cops did will shock you to your core. It's the kind of justice people talk about for decades, and it will leave you clapping at your screen. And if you believe bad cops should be exposed, hit that like button right now, share this video so the world sees it, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories like this, because here's where it all began. Officer Trent Mallory and Officer Rick Bowers were known in Ridgeford for all the wrong reasons. They had a reputation, and not the kind you'd want if you wore the badge. They were the kind of cops who smiled in front of the mayor, but rolled their eyes when they saw certain people walking down the street. And everyone in the minority community knew, if you got stopped by Trent or Rick, you were in for trouble. But no one expected what they'd do to a woman named Laverne Hayes that day. A woman who had lived in Ridgeford her entire life, paid her taxes, raised her kids right, and was loved in her neighborhood. Yet to these two cops, she was just another face they could target. And it all started when Laverne walked out of Parker's grocery store holding a bag of apples and a loaf of bread. Nothing unusual except the fact that Trent and Rick were sitting in their cruiser right across the street, eyes locked on her like they just found prey. Now here's the thing about Ridgeford. Main Street has one of those old-style parking lanes where cars line both sides and the sidewalks are narrow, meaning anyone getting stopped is on full display. So when Trent suddenly swung the cruiser up onto the curb, lights flashing, people started paying attention. Right away, Laverne froze, confused, the bread nearly slipping from her hands as Trent got out, swagger in every step. "Ma'am, we need to speak to you about a theft reported from this store," he said loud enough for half the street to hear. Laverne's eyes widened. "Theft? I just bought these," she said, holding up her receipt, but Rick was already circling her like a shark, muttering something under his breath about, "You people." Words Laverne heard clearly, and so did a young man across the street filming on his phone. Now let's pause here, because this is where you start to feel your blood boil, right? But keep watching, because what's about to happen will push you over the edge. Trent grabbed the receipt, glanced at it, and instead of admitting they were wrong, he smirked. "Could be a fake," he said, and before she could respond, Rick yanked the bag from her hands, apples rolling onto the sidewalk, bread tearing open, people gasping as if they couldn't believe this was happening, and in the middle of it all, Rick gave her a shove. Light enough to deny if someone asked later, but hard enough for her to stumble into the wall, and that's when Laverne's boss, yes, her actual employer, Franklin Keats, stepped out from the coffee shop 2 doors down. Franklin was a big man in both size and personality. He owned 3 businesses in Ridgeford, employed over 40 people, and he didn't play games when it came to injustice. "What the hell are you doing?" he barked, stepping between Laverne and the cops. Trent puffed up like a rooster. "Police business, sir, step aside." But Franklin didn't move, and this is the moment right here where the fuse got lit, because Franklin wasn't just a business owner, he was also a man with deep connections. Friends on the city council, a cousin in the state attorney's office, and a good relationship with the incoming police chief. Something Trent and Rick clearly didn't think about before acting. "This woman works for me," Franklin said. "She's honest, hard-working, and I know she didn't steal a damn thing. So either you apologize to her right now, or you're going to regret every second of what you're doing." But Trent laughed. Rick muttered, "Stay in your lane." And just like that, they doubled down, telling Franklin he could be arrested for obstruction. That's when Franklin pulled out his phone, tapped the record button, and started narrating every move they made, calling them out by name, and telling the growing crowd to keep their cameras rolling too. And here's where I want to remind you. If you're the kind of person who believes power without accountability is dangerous, go ahead and hit that like button right now, because what you're about to hear will make you believe in the kind of payback that doesn't require fists or violence, just strategy and a refusal to back down. See, Franklin didn't argue further. He let them finish their humiliation attempt, watched them write a bogus citation for suspicious activity, and then walked Laverne into his cafe, sat her down, and promised her that by the end of the week, Trent and Rick wouldn't be wearing those uniforms anymore. And here's the thing. When Franklin made promises like that, he delivered. The next 48 hours became a storm these 2 officers never saw coming. Starting with Franklin sending the footage to every media outlet he could think of, from local TV to national reporters who loved exposing small-town corruption. And it didn't stop there. He called in a favor to his cousin in the state attorney's office, handed over the footage along with sworn witness statements from everyone on the street, and the pressure started building so fast the police chief's office was forced to respond. But here's the twist. The current chief was on vacation, and the acting chief, Marisol Kane, was a no-nonsense leader who'd been itching to clean house for months. And when she saw the footage, she didn't just suspend Trent and Rick, she ordered an internal affairs investigation, froze their access to the evidence room, and pulled their patrol rights. Now you might think that's the end. But oh no, because Franklin wasn't done, and over the next few days, he unleashed a plan that would ensure these two not only lost their jobs, but also faced criminal charges for past behavior they thought was buried forever. Franklin knew that just getting Trent and Rick suspended wasn't enough, because suspension in Ridgeford PD was basically a paid vacation. He wanted something permanent, something that would make an example so loud every cop in the county would think twice before abusing their badge. So that same night, after closing the cafe, he sat in his office, lights low, phone pressed to his ear, calling in every favor he had. Starting with Councilman Harris, a man who owed Franklin more than one political boost during his campaign. Harris, I've got 2 racist officers on video harassing one of my employees, shoving her, destroying her groceries, calling her you people in front of a crowd. You want to be the councilman who ignores that? Franklin's tone was sharp. Harris hesitated but then said, "Send me the footage." And Franklin sent it to him, knowing that Harris had enough clout to get the city attorney breathing down the department's neck. Next he called Denise Walker, a journalist with the Ridgeford Gazette who had a reputation for digging up dirt like a bloodhound. Franklin knew she'd already covered whispers about Trent and Rick before. Little incidents swept under the rug. Denise answered on the first ring. "Frank, what have you got for me?" Franklin didn't waste a second. "I've got your next front page story." And when she saw the footage, Denise swore under her breath and promised it'd run in the morning with an editorial about systemic racism in small-town policing. Now this is where things got interesting, because once the story hit the paper, it didn't just stay local, it spread online. People were sharing it on Facebook, tagging big activist accounts on Twitter, and within hours, Franklin was getting calls from civil rights organizations asking how they could help. But the best call came from someone unexpected, Acting Chief Marisol Kane herself. "Mr. Keats, I saw the footage. I want you to know I've already initiated IA proceedings against Mallory and Bowers, and I'm expanding it to look into prior complaints." Franklin smiled to himself. "Chief Kane, I'll make sure the whole town knows you're not afraid to clean house." Kane chuckled, but her tone was deadly serious. "This isn't just about public perception. I've been waiting for a case strong enough to force the DA's hand, and yours is it." And that's when Franklin realized this wasn't going to be just a slap on the wrist, this was going to be a career ender. But to make it airtight, Kane needed more than one incident, so Franklin went digging, reaching out to old friends, former employees, even that bar owner on the south side who everyone knew had been targeted by Trent last year over bogus licensing inspections. And sure enough, the stories poured in. People who'd been stopped for no reason, cars searched without warrants, intimidation tactics, and always targeting minorities. Franklin didn't just collect these stories, he got them on record, names, dates, and in some cases, video footage from security cameras they didn't even know they still had. And as this mountain of evidence grew, Franklin called Denise again. "We're not just doing one article. We're doing a series, each one exposing another act of abuse. We'll keep the heat on until they burn out." And she agreed. Now by day 3, Trent and Rick were starting to sweat. They weren't in uniform. They weren't allowed to access department systems. And everywhere they went, people were whispering. One woman even filmed herself confronting them in a grocery store aisle asking, "How's it feel to be the most hated cops in Ridgeford?" And that video went viral too. Rick's temper was boiling. Trent was calling in favors with old buddies in the department. But here's the thing. They didn't realize how alone they really were, because once the footage hit the news, most officers distanced themselves, not wanting to get dragged down with them. By day 4, Franklin had lined up a town hall meeting, officially about community police relations, but unofficially about getting these two fired. He used his businesses to sponsor refreshments, flyers, and even live-streamed the event so more people could see it. And when the meeting began, the room was packed. Locals, activists from out of town, reporters, even city officials, and when Franklin took the mic he didn't waste time. For days ago, 2 officers humiliated a hard-working citizen for no reason other than the color of her skin. Today we demand accountability. Not just for that day, but for every day they've abused their power. The applause shook the walls. Trent and Rick weren't there, but their names were on posters, on social media feeds being projected on the wall. And with every testimony from citizens who'd been mistreated, Franklin could feel the weight crushing down on them. Now here's where the story takes a sharp turn, because while Franklin was pushing on the public front, Chief Kane was moving on the legal one. She had IA pull every single body cam and dashcam file from the last 2 years, cross-referencing with citizen complaints, and what they found was damning: missing footage where there shouldn't be, altered reports, and in one case, video that clearly showed Trent planting a small bag of marijuana during a traffic stop. Kane didn't sit on it. She sent it straight to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for criminal charges, and now the DA was in, which meant arrest warrants were just a matter of time. Franklin didn't know the exact moment they'd be served, but he had a hunch it'd be soon, and when it happened he wanted it on camera, so he tipped Denise to keep her crew ready. Sure enough, on the morning of day 6, Kane called him personally. "Frank, they're going in for the arrests in 20 minutes. Franklin grabbed his phone, texted Denise, and within minutes, multiple news crews were stationed outside the Ridgeford PD. Cameras rolling as IA officers escorted Trent and Rick out in handcuffs, faces red, eyes darting to the cameras they couldn't escape. And this is where you might think the story ends with a neat little bow. But you'd be wrong, because Franklin wasn't done. See, he knew that even if they were convicted, they could try to get jobs as security guards or in smaller departments elsewhere, so he worked with a civil rights lawyer to file a civil suit, not just against them personally but against the department for failure to supervise, and in that suit, he requested something specific: a public database entry marking them as officers terminated for misconduct, something that would follow them wherever they went, and after months of legal maneuvering he got it. The suit settled with a payout to Laverne, mandatory reforms in the department, and Trent and Rick barred from law enforcement for life. Now here's the part that makes this story legendary. On the day the settlement was announced, Franklin threw a block party right there on Main Street, the same spot where they'd humiliated Laverne. Except this time, the whole community came together, music playing, free food, Laverne cutting the ribbon on a new scholarship fund Franklin had started in her name for local kids, and every camera was there. Broadcasting the victory, Franklin took the mic and said, "This is what happens when a community stands together, when we don't let fear or power silence us." The crowd roared, and if you believe in standing up to injustice no matter the risk, hit that like button, share this video so more people know what's possible, and make sure you subscribe, because the next story I'm bringing you will make this one look like a warm-up. But as for Ridgeford, the message was clear. Racism in uniform would be met with a wall of resistance too strong to break, and Trent and Rick, once feared by many, were now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Their badges gone, their names a stain in the history books of the town they thought they controlled, and Franklin? He went back to running his businesses, but everyone knew, if corruption ever tried to rear its head again, he'd be there, ready to fight, ready to win. Because in Ridgeford, they'd learned the hard way that the boss wasn't someone you crossed without paying the price. Franklin thought the battle was over after the arrests, but the truth was, the aftermath was just as important as the fight itself, because corrupt cops rarely go down without trying to drag someone with them, and Trent and Rick were no exception. Sitting in the county jail awaiting arraignment, they began whispering to reporters that Franklin was out to get them because of a personal vendetta. Even hinting that he had ties to shady business dealings. It was a desperate move, but Franklin knew if he didn't squash it fast, rumors could muddy the victory, so he doubled down on transparency, inviting local journalists into his businesses, showing his books, opening his tax records, proving that everything he owned was legitimate. The more open he was, the more the public rallied behind him. And here's the thing, Franklin understood perception was power, so every step he took was public, deliberate, and broadcast on social media. If you've ever seen a man turn defense into offense, so Seamlessly, you know exactly why I'm telling you to hit that like button right now, because Franklin was playing chess while they were still fumbling with checkers, but even as he was clearing his own name, he wasn't done making sure there stayed buried behind the scenes. Chief Kane's internal affairs team was digging through years of complaint files, many of them marked unsubstantiated, because the victims had no hard proof. But with the new spotlight, witnesses were coming forward with fresh courage. One man named Terrence Lowe told Franklin that 5 years earlier, Trent had pulled him over, accused him of having stolen electronics in his trunk, then smashed his taillight accidentally when Terrence refused to open it without a warrant. Terrence had been too afraid to speak then, but now he was ready, and Franklin made sure his story was recorded and sent straight to Kane and the DA meanwhile. Rick's past was coming back to haunt him too, including a bar fight off duty, where he allegedly used racial slurs and threatened to make someone disappear. The incident had been buried after a lack of witnesses' claim, but Franklin tracked down a bartender from that night who remembered every word and was willing to testify. And here's where things started to snowball. Because as more stories came out, the DA's office realized they weren't just looking at 2 bad arrests. They were building a case for a pattern of abuse, something that could lead to federal civil rights charges. Franklin's phone was buzzing constantly, reporters, activists, attorneys, even state officials calling to say they'd been following the story. And in the middle of it all, Laverne was becoming a symbol in Ridgeford. People stopping her in the street to thank her for not backing down, kids in the neighborhood calling her Miss L, saying she was a hero, and Franklin saw an opportunity to turn this into something lasting. He worked with the city to set up a community oversight committee made up of local citizens to review complaints against the police. It wasn't easy. There was pushback from the police union, angry letters to the editor claiming Franklin was anti-cop, but he kept reminding people, "We're not against good cops, we're against bad ones." And that line stuck, repeating in interviews, on signs at rallies, even painted on the side of a local mural. Now you might think Trent and Rick would keep quiet with so much stacked against them, but instead their lawyers tried to flip the script, filing motions to suppress the grocery store footage, claiming it was prejudicial and taken out of context. It was laughable, and Franklin wasn't about to let it slide. He attended the hearing, sitting right in the front row, and when the judge ruled the footage was admissible, Franklin gave a slow, deliberate nod in their direction, the kind of look that said, "Checkmate." But the real bombshell came 2 weeks later, when Chief Kane called Franklin into her office. "Frank, there's something you need to see," she said, pulling up a body cam archive file that had been overlooked at first. The footage showed Trent and Rick during a late-night patrol the year before, stopping a young black man named Darren Wyatt, accusing him of looking suspicious, frisking him, and then joking on camera about sending him back where he came from, even though Darren was born and raised in Ridgeford. The casual cruelty in their voices made Franklin's hands clench. "We're turning this over to the feds," Kane said. "This isn't just department misconduct anymore, this is a civil rights violation." And within days the FBI had opened an investigation, which meant Trent and Rick were now looking at federal prison time. Franklin didn't celebrate yet. He knew cases could drag on for years, but he made sure the community stayed engaged, organizing town halls, sharing updates, encouraging people to keep speaking up. And if you're still watching this, I want you to think about what one determined person can do when they refuse to be silent. Hit that share button so more people hear stories like this, because the louder we are, the harder it is for injustice to hide. Months went by, the trial date finally arrived, and the prosecution's case was airtight. Footage, witness testimony, a paper trail of altered reports, even other officers testifying about the toxic culture Trent and Rick brought to the force, and when the jury came back, it was unanimous. Guilty on multiple counts, including civil rights violations and evidence tampering. The judge didn't hold back either, sentencing them to 12 and 15 years respectively, no chance of parole for at least a decade, and ordering them to pay restitution to several victims, including Laverne, who used the money to put a down payment on her first home. The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Franklin stayed seated just watching, because this was more than a win. It was a shift in the balance of power in Ridgeford. For years, people had whispered about bad cops and shrugged, saying, "What can you do?" Now they knew exactly what you could do, and Franklin's name was forever tied to that change. Even after the sentencing, Trent and Rick tried to appeal, but every higher court tossed it out. The evidence was too overwhelming, and eventually, they faded into prison life. Forgotten by most but remembered by those who knew the price of their actions. Franklin didn't gloat, but when asked in an interview if he felt vindicated, he smiled and said, "I feel like Ridgeford is a little safer now. That's enough." And as the years passed, the scholarship fund in Laverne's name grew. The oversight committee caught and corrected other potential abuses before they escalated. And the police department slowly rebuilt its reputation under Chief Kane's leadership. Yet every now and then, someone new in town would hear the story, see the footage and shake their head in disbelief, and Franklin would just nod, knowing that history had been written in those tense days of summer, and it was written in a way that could never be erased. In the months after the sentencing, most people assumed the chapter was closed, but Franklin knew better, because if there was one thing he understood, it was that the real lesson came not from the punishment itself, but from how the story was told and remembered. And that's why he wasn't just content to let the headlines fade into history. He wanted this case to serve as a warning far beyond Ridgeford. So he began reaching out to national media outlets, sending them not only the original grocery store footage but also a carefully compiled timeline of every step taken from that moment to the courtroom verdict. When Justice Watch Weekly picked it up, the story exploded across the country. Suddenly Ridgeford's fight was being discussed in coffee shops in Los Angeles, barber shops in Atlanta, and dinner tables in Chicago. And Franklin found himself on national television, sitting across from seasoned anchors, who couldn't believe how one business owner had managed to take down two officers who had operated unchecked for years. If you've been watching from the start, you know why I keep saying hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this prove how powerful truth can be when it's amplified, and Franklin's truth was now a wildfire, but it didn't stop there, because with national attention came new information. People from neighboring towns reached out with eerily similar encounters with Trent and Rick during joint patrols, and while the cases were too old for new charges, they painted an even darker picture of the culture they had thrived in. Chief Kane took those accounts seriously, launching a department-wide retraining initiative that made it mandatory for officers to attend bias training and community engagement workshops. Franklin was invited to speak at the first session, standing in front of uniformed men and women who knew his story and understood the message: abuse your badge, and you will be held accountable. Still, the part of the story most people didn't know until later was that Franklin had one more ace up his sleeve. Months before the arrests, when the investigation was still in its early stages, he had quietly worked with Denise Walker and a trusted private investigator to run a sting operation, planting an actor in town posing as a recently relocated immigrant with a used car in bad shape. They parked the car in a lot Trent and Rick often patrolled, cameras hidden inside and out, and waited. Sure enough, within a week, both officers approached, questioning the man about his papers, threatening to tow the vehicle unless he paid a fine on the spot. The entire exchange was captured in crystal-clear audio and video. But Franklin didn't release it right away. He held it back like a loaded weapon. And when Trent and Rick's lawyers tried to push for lighter sentences, Franklin handed the footage to the DA, killing any chance of a deal. This move was never made public until after the verdict, and when people heard about it, Franklin's legend grew even larger, not as a man who got lucky with one viral video, but as someone who outplayed his opponents at every turn. And that's the thing about this story. Yes, it's about two racist cops getting what they deserved, but it's also about the strategy it takes to win against entrenched power, the patience to gather evidence, the courage to stand in the open, and the persistence to keep going when the other side plays dirty. By the time the first anniversary of the grocery store incident rolled around, Ridgeford had changed, not in some magical overnight way, but in small, steady shifts. Complaints were taken seriously. Citizens felt safer speaking out. And the line between the police and the public wasn't a wall anymore, it was starting to look like a bridge. Franklin marked the anniversary with another community event, this time not as a victory lap, but as a reminder, inviting other towns to send representatives to learn how they could set up their own oversight committees and community support funds. Dozens showed up, taking notes, asking questions, and promising to take the model back home. And Franklin knew then that this was bigger than Ridgeford, it was a template, a playbook for anyone facing the same struggle, and if you're hearing this right now, you're part of that ripple effect, so I'll say it again. Like this video, share it with someone who thinks change isn't possible, subscribe so we can keep shining a light where darkness tries to hide, because the next time injustice shows its face, maybe the person who stands up will be you. As for Trent and Rick, prison life stripped them of the swagger they once carried on Main Street. The last report Franklin heard was that Trent worked in the kitchen, Rick in the laundry, both keeping their heads down to avoid trouble, their names occasionally resurfacing online when someone new stumbled across the original footage and felt the same outrage the town had felt that day. And each time it was shared again, Franklin would get a message or a tag, a reminder that the fight they fought in Ridgeford wasn't forgotten. It was still teaching people, still sparking conversations, still making the powerful think twice. And Franklin? He didn't call himself a hero, didn't hang plaques on his wall or boast about what he'd done. He just kept running his businesses, showing up to community meetings, and making sure that anyone who walked into his cafe, no matter who they were, was treated with respect, because in his mind, that was the real victory, not the headlines, not the interviews, but the everyday proof that dignity and fairness could survive in a place that had once turned a blind eye. And so when people asked him how he did it, how he went up against the badge and won, he'd smile and say, "You just don't let them scare you, you stand your ground and you keep the receipts, always keep the receipts." And if you've made it all the way to the end of the story, I'll tell you the same thing Franklin would. Never underestimate what one determined person can do when they're fighting for what's right. Now go ahead and hit that like button, share this with everyone you know, and subscribe so you're here for the next one. Because I promise you, the fight for justice isn't over. And the next time a boss makes corrupt cops regret their choices, you'll hear it here first.